And now we're back into the part of the chapter where you're looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the community. A community-centered system can solve some of the problems that market-centered systems cannot. Because you are in a more face-to-face interaction situation, you have great trust that can lower the transaction costs that might be part of a more impersonal market transaction. The negative externalities, the public goods that markets can't solve easily on their own without some sort of intentional plan, is something that can be overcome in the community. And the community, one of its purposes is to accumulate social capital, cultural capital, and human capital. So all of this can lead to an increase in prosperity. However, there is a dark side potentially with the community-centered system that could actually lead to lowered prosperity. You don't have a lot of mobility moving around because you are by definition within this community. There's a possibility that you're not using things to their utmost of efficient use because that's more of a market value. Institutional sclerosis you could see in the guilds that I was mentioning. Even though that was the beginning of mercantilism, that was really a community-based idea, and it was a way to protect the people in the industry, but then that can cause sort of a stagnation and a lack of innovation, and certainly not leading to lower costs. So there's just various challenges if you're going to go in a community system that can, instead of enhancing prosperity, lead to lower prosperity. I wanted to include how communities impact freedom because that's where he discusses collective action problems. And that's one of the early things he's introduced us to in this book, is that a struggle the market has in solving collective action problems, because the market model is pursuing your self-interest, and the collective action problem is a problem where pursuing your self-interest does not actually lead to the best interest for all. Communities are very good at handling these problems in a variety of ways, but they can have an expectation of behavior, an expectation of how you should act that is not going to be your self-interest, but it is that a way that will have everybody acting in the interest of the whole society. But where communities could struggle with the issues around freedom is the very strengths of the community that helps it be cohesive can actually lead to too much homogeneity, too much intolerance to any other way of being or way of thinking, and oppression of those in and maybe outside the community. And there isn't really an opportunity for social mobility. You have your role. You need to fulfill your role for the better of the community. The community-centered system can do a very good job of being sustainable, whether you're talking about sustaining the environment and taking care of the environment, the market, the state itself. So it's very good at being supportive to the other realms, because the community is able to think long-term. It's able to value what is good for all people, what is good for all people today, and what is good for all people looking forward. One of the biggest problems for communities is the challenge of the institutional crowding out, which means that some institutions or governance mechanisms are more vulnerable and fragile than others and tend to lose vitality unless there is a conscious effort made to protect them. Communities are particularly subject to institutional crowding out due to the self-interested behavior associated with markets, as well as the power of the state to impose laws or take responsibilities for providing social services, essentially taking over functions that could be done by the community. And so this crowding out of the community would weaken that realm, and then ultimately that can hurt the other realms as well. As far as human development goes, community-centered system might be one of the more enjoyable ones to be in, as long as you are the sort of person that fits in well with the people of your community, because you're going to be given your role. There's an expectation of how you should behave. Here's your identity. It's all decided for you. And the socialization process of living in the community is about promoting virtue and not allowing opportunism, which can be a problem in the market-centered world, to run amok. But the challenge would be living in a community when you don't really fit in well with the role that they're assigning you or the overall community norms. And that pressure of conformity can be very challenging. It can make it feel like your individual development is being suppressed. Finally, communities can play an important role in supporting democracy. We mentioned in an earlier time that you can make an argument that there is such a thing as rational ignorance for voters, where if you look at it from a self-interested point of view, it doesn't make sense to expend the time and effort to become educated enough to vote. However, if you don't use the market way of thinking, but you think about what you owe your community, then it can make sense to be an engaged member and to do the things you should do as a civic member. You should learn about the issues, you should get involved, you should volunteer, and you should, of course, take the time to vote and support the democracy. But where communities can be problematic for democracy is more along the idea of imagine various special interest groups, each one is a community, and the pressure they can put on the state for their specific preferences. And so that can cause the government to kind of clog up, which is the demosclerosis word that they have there. And it can lead to the politicians going with the immediate benefits, not worrying about the cost, which can obviously cause problems in the long run. That's the idea of the rational myopia. And just in general, if you have these interest groups proliferating and they become more numerous, their conflicting pressure on the government can actually lead to political gridlock and dysfunction. So he concludes the chapter with the acknowledgement that communities of the three governance structures are the most vulnerable to institutional crowding out. And with that in mind, he's giving us here 5 policies that we could use to revitalize communities if we find that they are getting crowded out. So community development grants could be something where the state, or should I say the government, is actually funding or providing the funding for cultural and recreational activities. So you could let the community organizations actually implement this, but they need the funding to be able to do it. Social benefits to protect communities from the corrosive effects of markets. Governments can offer social benefits to encourage certain community activities, such as taking care of the children, taking care of the elderly, and that sort of thing. So it could be stipends or tax deductions for people who have these sorts of dependents. With laws and regulations, that would be governments targeting laws and regulations to be supportive of community development. That could be zoning laws to protect the neighborhoods, all sorts of things like that. Selective stimulus is about the idea that not all communities are equally valuable in building a successful economic system. So you want to target those that will make the biggest difference to the strength of the community that is supportive of the other 2 realms. So professional associations and industry groups may not be something that we need to target with government funds, but things that are actually helping to build social, cultural, and human capital, that might be where we want to aim our financial support. So things that are helping young people, organizations that are helping young people, maybe neighborhood associations or service clubs, that sort of thing. And then the principle of subsidiarity does fall in line here if you're trying to prevent institutional crowding out, because that's just the idea that you want the lowest level of a system to provide something. So for example, using government language, you wouldn't want the federal government to provide a service that could be provided more easily at the local levels. You always want to go down to the lowest level at which something can be effectively provided. So examples of communities taking responsibility for public functions could include neighborhood watch groups, volunteer fire departments, that sort of thing. Alrighty, we've done it. We've made it through the first 5 chapters, and we now have an understanding of all 3 economic systems, and we're going to be able to take this knowledge forward and start applying it to the various countries that you'll be reading about, one of which that you'll be presenting, and then also taking the style of analysis that we'll see in those chapters to apply it to a country that you will be researching as well. All right, enjoy the rest of the course.